In a midnight diner outside Chicago, 22-year-old waitress Cassie Miller bent to clean a booth and found a diamond ring glinting in the shadows. Not costume jewelry, but a fortune, heavy with history. For a girl drowning in hospital bills and double shifts, it looked like salvation. But returning it led her straight into the Vance mansion, where one lost heirloom cracked open a 60-year secret about love, betrayal, and a legacy that refused to stay buried. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What if the most expensive thing in a cheap diner wasn't on the menu but glinting beneath a cracked vinyl booth? The highway hummed like a distant tide as midnight peeled away from the outskirts of Chicago. Grease hung in the air with the comfort of old quilts and the warning of a storm. Under the buzzing neon, half the open sign dead, the N sputtering, Cassie Miller wiped ketchup constellations from a Formica tabletop and listened to the building settle. The diner breathed. The low throb of the refrigerator, the rattle of a loose vent, the whispery scrape of her rag. Coffee had burned down to something tar-black and bitter. The smell clung to her hair even through the citrus of cheap dish soap dried onto her knuckles. In the corner, a napkin holder reflected her in slivered chrome. 22, tired eyes, ponytail coming loose, apron pencil behind one ear like a flag of surrender. The last two truckers had tipped in quarters. They left the way people do when they've told their stories twice and the map keeps unrolling. Cassie watched their taillights through the diner's big window until they dissolved. The booths were empty, the pie case down to a single perfect slice of cherry sweating under the glass. On the counter, a stack of hospital mail leaned against the register, as if catching its breath. Her younger sister's name showed through the envelope window, followed by a number with too many commas. The envelopes were soft at the corners from being opened, reopened, and folded again like prayer. The manager's office door was shut, a wedge of fluorescent light pooling under it. She could still hear his earlier barking, clock in on time, stop comping sides to regulars, wipe the baseboards, this isn't charity. She'd nodded, swallowed the heat in her throat, and saved her breath for later. Later always came after midnight. It came when the diner emptied, and what was left were dishes, silence, and the way fatigue made the room feel underwater. She bent to collect a sugar packet that had skittered beneath booth 3 and saw it, a spark in the dark. It wasn't the penny someone had flattened under a train for luck, nor the rhinestone that popped off the jacket of a teenager who hadn't looked her in the eye. This light was quiet and steady, the way a lighthouse is to a ship that believes in shore. She pushed her damp rag aside and reached into the shadow, where dust bunnies clung to the underside of the vinyl like little ghosts. Her fingers found a ring. It sat on her palm, colder than the table, weightier than it looked. Gold warmed to rose by age, a diamond with a deep, old soul cut that caught the diner light and turned it into milk and lightning. The band had tiny engravings, almost worn away. It felt like a voice from a long time ago, asking a question and not telling the answer. Cassie's breath snagged. She wasn't the type to imagine messages in objects. Still, the ring's chill crawled up her wrist as if the metal remembered snow. She glanced around out of habit. No one. Just the red vinyl booths like pews for late-shift confessions. The floor still gritted underfoot with salt dragged in on boots. Outside, a plow scraped distant sparks off asphalt. Inside, the wall clock above the coffee station kept time with a lazy tick, an old cat blinking. 12:41. She turned the ring under her thumb. It wasn't the size of the rock, though it was bigger than anything she'd ever worn, It was the way it seemed to hold a room by the throat. Old money. Real history. Someone had planned to pass it down. Someone had slipped it off and forgotten, or never meant to. Her mind lurched straight to the bills. Surgery. The word tasted sterile, then metallic, then like pennies on the tongue. Her sister's heart had a valve that didn't believe in opening on schedule. Doctors said it could be fixed, and the hospital said the world cost what it cost. Cassie's days had narrowed. Waitress at night, folding sheets at the laundromat by day. Bus rides that stitched together neighborhoods like mismatched patches. She'd started measuring time not in hours, but in paychecks split into little lifeboats. This is rent. This is groceries. This is the minimum to stop the phone calls. She closed her fingers around the ring and felt its edges press into her skin. The diner had a lost and found that was really a drawer full of orphaned gloves and one sad scarf. Nothing in it came with a heartbeat. Nothing in it could sell for even a fraction of what gleamed in her hand. She pictured herself at a pawn shop she'd pass sometimes. Bars on the windows, posters in sun-faded colors promising cash for gold, watches, heirlooms. The ring on a felt tray. A man with a jeweler's loupe squinting at the stone. A number written on a slip of paper. Enough to stitch a hole in a life. Enough to erase some lines on a bill and put breath back into her sister's laugh. Enough to get yelled at by nobody for 30 whole days. The thought arrived like a train without brakes, and she stood very still and let it shake the room. Then the other thought followed. Slower, wearing its Sunday shoes. Someone had worn this ring and twisted it when nervous. Someone had been loved with it, or promised, or forgiven. Someone would be tracing the outline of their finger right now, bare, checking the pocket of a coat, the bottom of a purse, the gap between chair and booth. Someone would call the diner. The number was on the receipt. People always called for less. They called for scarves, tote bags, even a baseball cap once with a team that had lost. The ring had the weight of a story, and she had scooped it up like a coin. Cassie slid the ring onto her index finger just to feel it anchor. It didn't fit. It sat like a star perched on the wrong sky. Her reflection in the napkin holder fractured into several Cassies, one who turned it in, one who didn't, one who tried to do both and got crushed between. She flexed her hand, felt the whisper of the metal, heard the refrigerator cough. The world kept moving around her choice. The register clicked as the automatic night tally ran. Paper thrummed as though counting breaths. Cassie pulled the rubber band off the stack of hospital envelopes and tapped them into a neat line, as if by tidiness alone she could make order of anything. In the kitchen, the dish machine sighed and went quiet, leaving her alone with the clock. She had 15 minutes before she had to lock up, flip the sign, and step out into the cold that would freeze the breath in her mouth and make her eyes water. Then the bus, the walk, the key in the apartment door, the glow of the TV on mute, her sister sleeping curled like a comma, the world asking for more every day. A faint smear of grease shone on the diamond, her fingerprint in light. She imagined calling the number on the receipt from booth 3, hearing the voice on the other end tremble with relief. She imagined the pawn shop's neon instead, the tiny bell when the door opened, the way the man would look past her to the ring itself, because gold has charisma she did not. She imagined, for a dangerous half-second, a third choice, keeping it. Wearing it under her glove like a secret ember, a private vow that life could be heavier in the right ways. The clock ticked louder, or she only noticed it now. 12:47. The ring sat in her palm again, colder than before, as if reclaiming itself. She stood at the counter with the ring in one hand and the stack of bills in the other, the night pressing its face against the window to see which way she'd go. Her heartbeat made the smallest sound inside the smallest room. Cassie gripped the ring, looked up at the clock, and hovered on the edge between the drawer labeled Lost and Found and the door that led out into a different kind of weather. The morning broke gray over Chicago, and Cassie Miller walked into it like someone stepping into cold water. Her night shift ended at 2, but she didn't go home. She went straight to the laundromat on 35th where the hum of dryers swallowed thought. Steam pressed against her skin, carrying the smell of detergent too sharp to be clean. She clocked in, forced a smile at Mrs. Ruiz, who nodded without looking up, and began folding sheets that were still warm, as if they remembered other people's sleep. By 9, her hands ached. By noon, her eyelids dragged. The ring burned a secret inside her pocket, heavy against her thigh. She touched it sometimes without meaning to, fingertips brushing the edge of its cold band. She pictured sliding it across a pawn shop counter, the weight of envelopes gone, the phone no longer demanding. Temptation grew like a vine, curling around her ribs. Bills waited at home, a stack on the kitchen counter, each with her sister Lily's name on the envelope. The medical ones arrived like clockwork, always bold, always urgent. Lily was only 16, yet the world treated her as a debt ledger. That afternoon, Cassie called to check in. The call was short. Lily tired easily now. Her voice was soft, a trembling whisper. "I'm scared, Cass." Cassie froze in the break room, surrounded by chipped lockers and the sour smell of burned coffee. She pressed the phone harder to her ear, as if she could lend her strength through wires. "It's going to be okay," she managed, but her throat closed as soon as she said it. She hung up quickly before her sister could hear her break. Tears blurred the laminated safety poster on the wall. She pulled the ring out of her pocket, held it up under the flickering fluorescent bulb. Its facets scattered the light into tiny, sharp fragments, pricking her eyes. She thought of her manager at the diner snapping at her for being slow with the mop, of neighbors whispering about the Miller girls always owing, always working. She thought of Lily's hospital bed, the beep of monitors, the way her sister gripped her hand so tight that Cassie's bones ached. Her heart slammed between choices: pawn the ring and save her sister, or return it and stay drowning. Either path could break her. That night, back at the diner, she set out coffee cups for the evening crowd. Her reflection fractured in their rims. Every clang of the kitchen bell startled her. Every door opening made her stiffen. She carried plates to truckers, to students with open laptops, to couples who didn't look at each other anymore. Each tip left behind, coins, a crumpled bill, looked pitiful against the gold burning in her pocket. The hours stretched, pulling at her like taffy. She moved faster, wiped harder, but the ring whispered louder. Lily's voice echoed, "I'm scared," until it threaded through the sound of sizzling bacon and clattering dishes. Cassie pressed her palm flat against her apron, over the hidden circle of metal, and bit her lip until she tasted iron. At 1 a.m., she leaned against the counter, watching the neon open flicker, as if it too were undecided whether to keep shining or give up. She imagined stepping into the pawn shop tomorrow, the glass door jingling, the man behind the counter weighing her secret. She imagined money exchanged, surgery scheduled, her sister's laugh returning like spring. But she also imagined a stranger's voice calling the diner, frantic, asking about a ring, a life collapsing because of what she held. The clock struck 2 o'clock. Cassie's shift ended. She untied her apron, but her hands lingered in the knot as though the cloth itself demanded an answer. The night wind outside rattled the windows. The ring in her pocket pulsed like a heartbeat not her own. And Cassie knew the decision would come sooner than she wanted. Snow powdered the sidewalks when Cassie finally decided she couldn't keep hiding. The ring seemed to grow heavier by the day, tugging at her conscience as much as her pocket. One afternoon, she sat at the bus stop outside the hospital, staring at its glass facade glowing like a beacon of debts, and made herself a promise. If she didn't at least try to find the owner, she would drown in guilt long before the bills did her in. The diner's receipt from booth 3 gave her a name: Margaret Vance. The surname lingered in her mind like perfume left too long on the air. She dialed the number scrawled across the order slip. A clipped, elderly voice answered. Cassie nearly hung up, but forced words out, awkward, halting, about a ring left behind. Silence stretched. Then the voice whispered, "Come, please, immediately." The mansion was nothing like the diner's neon-lit world. It stood behind iron gates on the edge of Lake Michigan. Stone walls streaked with winter shadows. Cassie's boots left wet marks across marble when she entered, her thrift store coat swallowed by the cavernous foyer. A housekeeper led her through gilded halls lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. Every breath Cassie drew tasted faintly of polish and age. Margaret Vance waited in a parlor dressed in velvet. Her hair was silver, arranged with the precision of someone who had lived by rules her whole life. When Cassie placed the ring on the table, Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for it. For a long moment, the old woman only stared, her throat working as though swallowing decades. This isn't just a ring," Margaret murmured finally. Her eyes lifted to Cassie, sharp but wet at the corners. "Where did you find it?" Cassie explained. Booth 3, midnight, cleaning tables. Margaret listened without interrupting. The ring clutched in her palm, as if it might vanish again. The parlor was hushed, save for the muted tick of a grandfather clock. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice was smaller. "You don't know what you've done. This belonged to my sister, Clara." Cassie blinked. "Your sister?" "She disappeared 60 years ago. One morning, gone. The family buried it." Margaret closed her eyes, knuckles white around the band. "We told the world she ran away. We told ourselves the same lie until we could almost believe it." Cassie shifted, uneasy in her diner shoes against Persian rugs. She had come expecting a simple return, maybe a thank you if luck was kind. Instead, she found a wound that hadn't closed in 6 decades. Margaret leaned forward. Her perfume was faint, powdery, carrying an ache of memory. "You've just touched the secret my family buried for 60 years, she whispered. Cassie's heart stumbled in her chest. The ring, once a ticket out of her poverty, had become a key to someone else's darkness. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows leaping across old portraits, as though the mansion itself held its breath. The ring no longer felt like a choice. It felt like a summons. And Cassie, waitress and laundromat girl, stood at the threshold of a story far larger than herself. Mini cliffhanger. Margaret's words echoed in the silence, wrapping around Cassie like chains. The secret my family buried for 60 years. The mansion felt colder the next time Cassie returned. Snow crunched under her boots, and the iron gate closed behind her with a sound that was more prison than welcome. Margaret Vance was waiting in a smaller study, not the grand parlor, as if secrets demanded smaller rooms. Books lined the walls, their spines cracked with age. On the desk lay a leather-bound sketchbook, its edges frayed, the paper yellowed. Margaret touched it with careful fingers. Clara drew everywhere she went. These are all that remain of her. Cassie hovered near the doorway, uncertain if she belonged in a space so rich with memory. She had come out of duty, intending only to listen, but as Margaret spoke, something inside her shifted. Clara was the gifted one, Margaret said softly. A painter who saw the world differently. Birds, mostly. She loved sparrows, called them her companions. Our father forbade her from wasting time with paint. He demanded obedience, marriages, heirs. She resisted. Cassie stepped closer, drawn to the sketchbook. The word sparrows tightened something in her chest. Lily loved sparrows. When the illness made her too weak to go outside, Cassie would sit at her hospital bed and point to the window whenever one landed on the sill. The sight always sparked a flicker of hope. Years earlier, Cassie had tattooed a tiny sparrow on her wrist. Her promise to Lily that she'd always protect her, no matter what the world demanded. Her breath caught as Margaret slid the sketchbook across the desk. "Open it. You'll understand." Cassie hesitated, then flipped it open. The smell of old paper rose like dust stirred in a forgotten attic. She turned a page, then another. There were sparrows everywhere, penciled in flight, perched on branches, huddled together against winter. Some were no larger than a thumbnail. Others filled the page with delicate wings. Then she froze. One drawing stopped her hand cold. It was a sparrow in mid-flight, its wings lifted, its eye bright. But what made her gasp was its uncanny likeness to the sparrow inked on her own wrist. The curve of the wing, the tilt of the beak, even the slight arch of its tail. The resemblance was exact, as if Clara had sketched it decades before Cassie carried it into her own skin. Her throat tightened. She pressed her hand against her wrist tattoo, then back to the page, her pulse racing. For a moment, the laundromat, the diner, even the hospital faded. Only the echo remained, the connection between a vanished painter and a waitress who had never known her. Margaret watched her closely, her gaze unreadable but intent. "Do you see?" Cassie swallowed hard, unable to form words. The sketch seemed to look back at her, a mirror across time. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a thread, tugging her deeper into Clara's silence, into something that might explain why the ring had found her. Outside, the lake wind howled against the window panes. Inside, Cassie felt her world tilt. She hadn't meant to step into anyone else's story. Yet here she was, staring at proof that maybe, just maybe, she belonged in it. Mini cliffhanger. Cassie traced the sparrow in the sketchbook, her own tattoo burning faintly beneath her sleeve. 2 marks of the same bird, one drawn decades ago, one carved into her skin. The Vance mansion unfolded like a world built to remind people of their place. No. Cassie stepped inside its marble halls and felt her diner shoes squeak against the polished floor, every sound accusing her of trespass. Chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above, and portraits of long-dead ancestors lined the corridors, their gazes cool and unwavering. Margaret guided her through rooms filled with paintings, sculpture, and glass cases that glittered with rare collections. "Clara's work would have hung here," Margaret whispered, her voice a mix of pride and regret. Cassie nodded, but her chest tightened. She carried the smell of fryer oil and detergent in her clothes, and the contrast pressed on her like a weight. At the heart of the house was the private gallery. The walls dripped with wealth, impressionist canvases, marble busts, landscapes captured in oil. Cassie lingered before a painting of the lake at dawn, its surface painted with such stillness she could almost feel the hush of water. Yet all she could think was how a month's rent sat in its gilded frame. Margaret's eyes lingered on her. "You see more than they expect you to." Cassie didn't answer. She was busy hiding her hands in her pockets, so no one would notice the calluses, the faint red lines from detergent burns. It wasn't long before others joined. "A family meeting," Margaret had said. They gathered in a drawing room bigger than Cassie's whole apartment building. Cousins, nephews, a lawyer with thin glasses and thinner lips. Every face seemed carved from the same stone, high cheekbones, practiced disdain. Margaret introduced her as the young woman who found Clara's ring. For a heartbeat, silence thickened the room. Then it cracked open with outrage. "She's just a waitress," one man barked, rising from his chair. His cufflinks gleamed like small suns. "Why involve her in family matters?" Another, a woman in pearls, scoffed. "She doesn't belong in the Vance legacy. This is absurd." Cassie felt heat crawl up her neck. Her instinct was to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But she remembered the sketchbook, the sparrow like her tattoo, the echo of Clara in her own life. She lifted her chin, though her hands shook out of sight. Margaret's voice sliced through the noise. "You forget yourselves. She brought the ring back when she could have stolen it. That alone makes her more honorable than most sitting here." Gasps and murmurs rippled. Cassie stood very still, the weight of a dozen eyes pressing into her. Her apron, her double shifts, her sister's fragile voice on the phone, none of that belonged here. Yet something else, something older than money, tied her to this room. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his words precise and cold. "Miss Miller should know when she's out of her depth. Curiosity can be dangerous." Margaret looked at Cassie, her expression unreadable but steady, a shield in a storm. Cassie swallowed hard. She had never felt more out of place, yet never more certain she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't turn away from. Mini cliffhanger. The family's voices rose in unison. "She's just a low-class waitress. Don't let her meddle in the Vance legacy." As Cassie stood trapped in the center, their anger like a tide ready to drown her. The days that followed moved like storms, quiet at first, then violent without warning. Margaret refused to let the family's venom chase Cassie away. "If Clara's truth is to be found," she told her, "it won't be through those who silenced her." So Cassie followed. They pored over old exhibits stored in museum archives, the smell of varnish and paper clinging to their coats. They unfolded diaries filled with looping handwriting that blurred with age, and leafed through sealed letters. Some never opened until that moment. Each clue was a fragment of Clara's vanished life. Sketches of birds, ticket stubs for trains that never returned, letters that hinted at arguments swallowed by silence. But the Vance family struck back with sharpened claws. One afternoon, Cassie returned to the mansion only to find two suited men blocking the entrance. "Miss Miller," one said flatly, "your presence is no longer welcome. You've been exploiting an old woman's grief for your own gain." Humiliation burned her throat. Margaret's relatives had planted the idea, painting her as a parasite clinging to privilege. Even the house staff avoided her eyes now, as if loyalty meant blindness. By evening, security escorted her off the property, her boots crunching against the gravel as the iron gates locked behind her. Cassie stood outside, wind slicing across her face, fury and shame tangled tight in her chest. She thought of Lily in her hospital bed, of the sparrow tattoo that once felt like a promise and now felt like a brand. For a heartbeat, she considered walking away, leaving the Vances to their secrets. But something deeper than pride kept her feet from moving. Clara's silence felt too familiar. That night, she wandered into the mansion's storage wing, a forgotten annex Margaret had hinted at. Dust powdered the floor, and the air smelled of damp wood and old paint. Rows of crates and boxes towered around her like silent sentinels. She pried open one with trembling hands, coughing as dust rose. Inside lay faded canvases and brittle journals wrapped in string. Beneath them, pushed to a corner as if someone meant to bury it forever, was a small wooden box. The latch was stiff, the hinges squealing as she forced it open. Inside rested an envelope, edges browned with age. Her breath caught as she unfolded the fragile paper. The ink had bled in places, but the words were unmistakable. To my child, if ever these words find you, know that I loved you before I left, and every day after. Cassie's vision blurred, her pulse roaring in her ears. A child. Clara had written to a child before vanishing, and no one had spoken of it, not in 60 years. The letter shook in her hands as the storage light flickered above her, shadows trembling across the walls. She knew now, this wasn't just history, this was blood. Mini cliffhanger. Cassie clutched the letter to her chest, dust swirling around her, realizing she had unearthed a secret too powerful for the Vances to ever forgive. The letter trembled in Cassie's hands all the way back to Margaret's study. She half expected guards to drag her out before she could speak, but Margaret was waiting by the fire, her face drawn tight with worry. When Cassie laid the fragile paper down, the old woman's eyes widened, and her hand covered her mouth. They read the letter together in silence. Clara's voice seemed to reach across 60 years, describing a love forbidden, a life shattered by the family's iron will. She wrote of a man who worked in the gardens, his accent foreign, his hands rough but kind. She wrote of a child she carried in secret, and she wrote of her fear that the Vances' cruelty would strip her of both. Margaret's shoulders sagged. I never asked. I never fought for her. Her voice cracked, brittle as the paper in Cassie's hands. I watched Father banish her, and I said nothing. Cassie's throat burned. She thought of Lily, sweet Lily who had never known freedom from illness, who clung to life because Cassie fought for her every day. And she thought of all the times she herself had bitten her tongue at the diner, endured her manager's sharp words, let neighbors gossip without striking back. That same silence Clara had suffered had followed Cassie her whole life like a curse. She slammed the letter onto the desk, startling Margaret. That silence killed Clara, and nearly killed my sister, too. Her voice echoed through the study, bouncing off the shelves of untouched books and the heavy drapes. Margaret flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. Cassie's own tears blurred the words inked across the page, but she refused to wipe them away. For the first time, Margaret spoke without the armor of wealth. You're right. My silence chained me to this house, to our father's cruelty, and I let Clara disappear into it. Cassie clenched her fists until her nails bit her palms. Lily doesn't have time for silence. Every day, every bill, Every breath is a fight. If Clara was punished for love, and my sister is punished for being weak, then maybe the punishment is this family's legacy. Margaret lifted her gaze, wet but fierce. Then we will break it, you and I. The words hung between them like an oath. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind rattled bare branches against the windows, a sound like bones clashing. Cassie pressed her hand over her wrist tattoo. The sparrow inked there, remembering Clara's sketch that matched it exactly. She felt the echo of two lives, one extinguished, one still struggling, meeting in her blood. The mansion no longer seemed grand. It felt like a mausoleum built from silence, but in that silence, Cassie had finally found her voice. Mini cliffhanger. Cassie gripped Clara's letter, her chest heaving, as Margaret whispered beside her, "The truth will cost us everything, but keeping it has already cost too much." The morning after, Cassie woke to the gray hum of the laundromat dryers. She hadn't slept. Clara's letter pulsed in her mind like a drumbeat. The words, "to my child," refused to loosen their grip. By noon, she was back at the Vance mansion, Margaret waiting with red-rimmed eyes and a folder of papers spread across her desk. "We can't leave this buried," Margaret said, "but the family's lawyer will never allow it. We need proof no one can dispute." Proof. The word weighed heavier than the ring ever had. Cassie thought of her sister in that hospital bed, monitors tracing fragile heartbeats, and knew this was no longer just about curiosity. Clara's truth was tethered to her own. Margaret leaned closer. Clara's child, her bloodline, it didn't vanish. If she had a baby, that child lived. Which means, Cassie interrupted, her voice sharp with disbelief. Which means it could be me. Silence thickened. The crackle of the fireplace filled the room. Margaret's hand trembled as she slid a small kit across the desk. A DNA test. Cassie recoiled. "I'm not... This isn't..." She pressed her palms against her temples. "I'm just a waitress, Margaret. My mother scrubbed motel floors. I grew up clipping coupons and catching buses that broke down in the rain. I'm not part of your world." Margaret's eyes softened, but her voice was steady. "You're not part of their world, Cassie, but you might be part of Clara's. There's a difference." For hours, Cassie paced the gallery, her reflection fractured in the glass of priceless frames. She thought of Lily, her only family, her anchor. If there was even a chance they were bound to Clara, maybe it explained why the sparrow tattoo mirrored Clara's sketch, why the ring had seemed to choose her. Finally, with hands shaking, she agreed. Margaret clasped her shoulders, whispering, "You carry my sister's fire. I can see it." The test was sent away. Days crawled by like winter shadows. Cassie worked both jobs, exhaustion painting bruises beneath her eyes, all while waiting for the envelope that might redraw her life. When it came, Margaret insisted they open it together. The study was quiet, but for the hiss of the radiator. Cassie slit the envelope with a letter opener shaped like a sparrow's wing. Her hands shook so badly the paper almost tore. She read the result once, twice. Her vision blurred, but the words stayed clear. Probability of relationship, 99.9%. Margaret's breath hitched. She reached across the desk, her jeweled fingers trembling as they grasped Cassie's work-rough hands. "You carry my sister's blood," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. Cassie's knees buckled. She let Margaret's embrace steady her, though her mind reeled. A waitress, a laundromat worker, a girl with empty pockets and a sick sister, and now Clara's granddaughter. The gallery seemed to tilt, paintings watching like witnesses to a truth finally spoken aloud. Mini cliffhanger. Margaret clung to her, tears wetting Cassie's shoulder, while Cassie's own heart thundered with one terrifying question. What happens now that the blood proves it? The revelation spread through the Vance estate like wildfire. Whispers carried down hallways, through marble chambers, across velvet parlors. A waitress, Clara's blood, was suddenly undeniable. The same relatives who once spat her name now avoided her eyes, as if truth itself was contagious. Margaret, however, did not hesitate. Within a week, she stood beside Cassie at a press conference in the grand foyer, chandeliers blazing above them. "My sister's legacy has been denied long enough," Margaret declared. Her voice rang sharp and clear, echoing against the marble. "Cassie Miller is Clara Vance's granddaughter, and she is family." The world inhaled. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, relatives clenched their jaws behind frozen smiles, but the storm had already broken. Soon after, Margaret made the promise Cassie had scarcely allowed herself to dream. Lily's treatment would be paid in full, no hesitation, no conditions. Cassie stood at her sister's hospital bedside as doctors spoke of surgery dates and recovery plans. For the first time in months, Lily's pale lips curved into a smile not forced by courage but lit by genuine hope. Yet Cassie couldn't simply sink into comfort. Wealth glittered all around her now. Black cars waiting outside, family lawyers suddenly polite, invitations pressed into her hand for gatherings where champagne poured like water. She could have let herself be remade, clothed in silk and silence. But the laundromat stains hadn't yet washed from her skin, and she refused to let them. So she turned Margaret's support into action. With funds Margaret offered freely, Cassie established the Clara Vance Art Foundation. Its mission was simple. No gifted artist would ever be silenced or abandoned as Clara had been. They rented a gallery downtown, brick walls, wide windows, the smell of paint still drying. Cassie herself hung the first piece, Clara's sparrow painting, framed with care, set beside a photograph of her own wrist tattoo. 2 sparrows, 2 eras, 1 promise. On opening night, artists arrived with trembling portfolios, their nervous laughter mixing with the clink of glasses. Cassie greeted them not as a benefactor, but as one of them, someone who had scrubbed grease off diner tables, someone who still carried calluses from folding other people's sheets. She insisted the foundation host workshops, give scholarships, offer meals. Art, she believed, shouldn't starve the hands that made it. The Vance family watched from the edges, stiff in their pearls and tailored suits. Some whispered that Margaret had gone mad. Others muttered about diluting the legacy. But Cassie stood taller beneath their scrutiny, her voice steady as she welcomed the crowd. "This is my family's story, but it's also every artist's story. Silence will not win again." Margaret, frail but glowing, pressed Cassie's hand as applause filled the gallery. "Clara would have been proud," she said, and Cassie, blinking back tears, realized she had found a way to belong without surrendering who she was. She was still a waitress, still a sister, but now also an heir, not to riches, but to a legacy of resilience and truth. Mini cliffhanger. As the crowd applauded beneath Clara's sparrow, Cassie's eyes shone, not only with belonging, but with the sharp awareness that the Vances who opposed her weren't finished yet. The gallery had emptied, its floors still echoing with footsteps and laughter. When Cassie finally stood alone before Clara's sparrow painting, the little bird seemed alive in the dim light, wings spread as if lifting off the canvas. Cassie raised her wrist, the tattoo beneath her sleeve glowing faintly in the glow, two sparrows staring at each other across decades. She thought of the ring, the glint under a diner booth that had pulled her into a world she never meant to enter. At first, it had seemed like an answer to her bills, a lifeline she didn't deserve but desperately needed. Now she knew it had been something else entirely, a summons, a demand for honesty in a family built on silence. Margaret joined her quietly, leaning on a cane, her eyes soft with exhaustion and peace. "You've done what I never could," she whispered. "You gave Clara her voice back." Cassie looked at her, then back at the painting. "If I had kept that ring, I would have lost more than I ever owed. I would have lost an entire family I didn't even know I had." Her words carried the weight of truth. She thought of Lily, now healing after surgery, her laughter returning like spring thaw. She thought of the foundation alive with art and voices. And she thought of the diner, the clatter of plates and the smell of burnt coffee, proof of the life she had come from and the roots she refused to abandon. The Vance relatives would never love her easily. Some would always see a waitress instead of an heir. But Cassie no longer cared. Her worth wasn't measured in their approval, nor in the glitter of diamonds. It was in the courage to stand, to speak, to carry both her sister and Clara forward. She touched the sparrow tattoo, smiling faintly. The ring wasn't about wealth. It was about connection, about the fragile but unbreakable threads between generations. Clara's silence had ended with Cassie's voice. The gallery lights dimmed. Outside, the city hummed with late-night traffic, the world turning as it always had. Cassie inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs not as a waitress or an heir, but as herself, no longer lost, no longer small. She turned to the empty room and spoke softly, as if to Clara, as if to anyone listening. "Honesty is heavier than gold, but it's the only weight worth carrying." Mini cliffhanger turned into resolution. Cassie walked out into the night with the certainty that her story, and Clara's, was no longer buried. If you believe honesty can change a life, like, comment, and subscribe.